The first crack in Victoria Aldridge's perfect porcelain smile happened when Melissa pointed at my 72-year-old mother and announced to our 204 wedding guests, "That's not a mother, that's a mistake in a dress." Victoria laughed, a sharp, crystalline sound that cut through St. Michael's Cathedral like broken glass. I stood at that marble altar watching my fiancé find genuine amusement in my mother's humiliation, and something cold settled in my chest. 3 hours later, I was systematically destroying the Aldridge family empire, one carefully placed phone call at a time, starting with their biggest client who happened to owe me a very significant favor. "Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button." Let me take you back to how I ended up in this mess. 6 months earlier, I was just Michael Henderson, 54 years old, running a successful construction consulting firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. My mother, Linda, had raised me alone after my father walked out when I was 8. She worked double shifts at a strip mall salon for 15 years, saving every penny so I could go to college without debt. She never remarried, never complained, and always showed up to every baseball game, every graduation, every milestone that mattered. Victoria Aldridge was everything my mother wasn't. Polished, connected, and wealthy beyond anything I'd ever imagined. We met when her father's development company hired my firm to oversee a massive downtown project. She was 38, twice divorced, and had that particular kind of confidence that comes from never worrying about money. The courtship was whirlwind. Expensive restaurants, private boxes at sporting events, weekend trips to places I'd only read about in magazines. The Aldridge family owned half of Charlotte's skyline. Gregory Aldridge, Victoria's father, had built their real estate empire over 4 decades, turning modest investments into a billion-dollar portfolio. Melissa, Victoria's mother, came from old Carolina money, the kind of family that had been wealthy so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to earn anything. Their world was charity galas, country club memberships, and the sort of casual cruelty that passes for conversation among people who've never faced real consequences. I should have seen the warning signs. The way Melissa's eyes would glaze over when I mentioned my mother's work. How Victoria would change the subject whenever I brought up my blue-collar background. The subtle corrections to my grammar, my choice of restaurants, even the way I held my fork. They were reshaping me, molding me into something more suitable for their social circle, and I was too flattered by their attention to notice the pressure. The wedding planning consumed 8 months of our lives. Victoria wanted everything perfect. The cathedral, the flowers, the guest list that read like a who's who of Charlotte's elite. My mother bought her first formal dress in 20 years. A modest navy blue outfit from Nordstrom that cost her 2 weeks' salary. She was so excited to be included, to finally meet the family I was marrying into. I remember her practicing small talk in my kitchen, nervous about making a good impression on people she assumed would welcome her son's happiness. The morning of the wedding, everything seemed flawless. Victoria looked radiant in her custom gown. The cathedral was filled with white roses and classical music, and 204 carefully selected guests had gathered to witness our union. My mother sat in the third pew, beaming with pride, clutching the small clutch purse she'd bought specifically for this day. She'd gotten her hair done at the salon where she used to work, and despite her nerves, she looked beautiful. That's when everything unraveled. The comment came during the receiving line, right after the ceremony. I was still buzzing with adrenaline, shaking hands and accepting congratulations when I heard my mother's voice rise slightly behind me. She was introducing herself to Melissa's sister, Patricia, explaining that she was Michael's mother. That's when Melissa stepped in, her voice carrying just far enough for nearby guests to hear. "Oh, Patricia, let me save you the confusion. That's not a mother, that's a mistaken address. I think she wandered in from the catering staff." The words hit me like a physical blow. But what happened next was worse. Victoria, my brand new wife, started laughing. Not a nervous giggle or a shocked gasp, but genuine, delighted laughter. She found her mother-in-law's humiliation genuinely amusing. Several guests turned to stare, their own uncomfortable laughter mixing with the sound of my world collapsing. My mother's face went white, then red, then crumpled into something I'd never seen before. Pure shame. She stammered an apology and stepped backward, clutching her purse like a shield. The woman who had sacrificed everything for my future was being treated like she was invisible, worthless, a source of embarrassment at my own wedding. I looked at Victoria, waiting for her to defend my mother, to say something kind, to show even basic human decency. Instead, she whispered to her cousin, loud enough for others to hear, "Maybe next time we should have provided a dress code chart with stick figures." That's when I understood what I'd really married into. This wasn't just casual snobbery or wedding day stress. This was who they were. People who found genuine pleasure in making others feel small, who saw kindness as weakness and cruelty as entertainment. And Victoria wasn't an exception to her family's values. She was their perfect representative. I excused myself from the receiving line and found my mother in the cathedral bathroom, trying to fix her makeup with shaking hands. She looked up at me in the mirror and I saw something I'd never seen in her eyes before. Defeat. "I'm so sorry, Michael," she whispered. "I ruined your wedding. I don't belong here." "Mom," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You didn't ruin anything." They did, but she wasn't listening. She was already planning her escape, talking about catching an earlier flight home, about how she should have known better than to think she fit into my new life. 20 years of therapy couldn't have hurt me more than watching my mother apologize for existing in a space where she had every right to be. I helped her to the car, told her I'd call later, and watched her drive away from what should have been one of the happiest days of both our lives. Then I walked back into that cathedral, past the ice sculptures and crystal chandeliers, past the guests who were now whispering about the awkward moment with Michael's mother, and I stood at the altar looking at my bride. Victoria was holding court near the altar, retelling the story to a group of her friends, each retelling making my mother sound more ridiculous, more out of place. She saw me approaching and smiled, expecting me to laugh along, to join in the mockery of the woman who had raised me. Instead, I walked to the microphone that was set up for toasts. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying across St. Michael's Cathedral with perfect acoustic clarity, "I have an announcement to make." 204 faces turned toward me. Victoria's smile faltered as she realized this wasn't part of the planned program. The classical quartet stopped mid-song. Even the catering staff paused in the doorways, sensing something significant was about to happen. 30 minutes ago, my new mother-in-law decided to humiliate my mother in front of all of you. She called a 72-year-old woman who worked 2 jobs to put her son through college a mistaken address. My wife found this hilarious. The silence in the cathedral was absolute. You could hear the air conditioning cycling on, the rustle of expensive fabric as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Victoria had gone completely pale, her bouquet trembling in her hands. "So I have a choice to make," I continued, looking directly at Victoria. "I can pretend this didn't happen, laugh along with the joke, and spend the rest of my life married to someone who thinks cruelty is entertaining. Or I can have some respect for the woman who sacrificed everything so I could stand here today." Gregory Aldridge had gone red-faced, clearly calculating how much this public humiliation would cost his family socially and financially. Melissa looked like she was about to faint. The wedding photographer had stopped taking pictures, unsure whether to document this moment for posterity. "Victoria," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's acoustics, "I'm annulling this marriage. I won't be married to someone who laughs at my mother's pain." The gasps echoed off the stone walls like gunshots. Victoria dropped her bouquet, the white roses scattering across the marble floor. Someone in the back of the cathedral whispered, "Oh my God," loud enough for everyone to hear. "The reception is canceled," I announced. "The gifts will be returned. The honeymoon suite at the Grove Park Inn is now available for anyone who wants it. I'm going home to check on my mother." I walked down that marble aisle, past stunned faces and dropped jaws, past people holding up cell phones to record the most dramatic wedding disaster Charlotte had ever witnessed. Behind me, I could hear Victoria's voice rising to a shriek demanding someone do something. "Stop this, fix it somehow." But there was nothing to fix. She had shown me exactly who she was, and I had decided I wouldn't spend my life pretending not to see it. The drive to my mother's house took 20 minutes. I still had rice in my hair and my boutonniere was crushed, but I needed to see her before this story spread, before she heard about it from anyone else. I found her in her kitchen, still in her navy dress, making tea with hands that shook slightly. "Michael," she said, looking up with red-rimmed eyes. "What are you doing here? Shouldn't you be at your reception?" "There's no reception, Mom," I said, sitting across from her at the same table where she'd helped me with homework 30 years ago. "There's no marriage either." I told her what I'd done, how I'd stood up in front of Charlotte's elite and chosen her dignity over their approval. She cried then, not from sadness but from something deeper. Relief that her son hadn't forgotten where he came from, that her sacrifice hadn't been for nothing. That night I sat in my condo reviewing everything I knew about Aldridge Development, everything I'd learned during our 6-month engagement, every piece of information Victoria had casually shared about her family's business deals. They had humiliated my mother, thinking I was too infatuated, too invested in their world to fight back. They were about to learn how wrong they were. By Monday morning, my voicemail was full. Reporters, wedding guests, and business associates who had heard about Charlotte's most spectacular wedding disaster. I ignored them all and focused on the real work, researching everything I could about Aldridge Development's current projects and financial partnerships. Victoria had been careless with information during our engagement, the way wealthy people often are when they assume everyone around them is either ally or victim, never competitor. She'd mentioned her father's frustration with city council delays on the Lincoln District project. She'd complained about cash flow problems tied up in zoning disputes. She'd even laughed about how they sometimes had to grease the wheels with certain municipal officials. Most importantly, she'd introduced me to Thomas Whitmore, the city planning director, at a charity auction 3 months ago. Thomas and I had hit it off, bonding over our shared background. We were both first-generation college graduates who'd worked construction before moving into management roles. He'd given me his card and mentioned that his department was always looking for independent consultants to review major development proposals. I called Thomas Tuesday afternoon. "Michael," he said, his voice warm but curious, "I heard about what happened at your wedding. Are you all right?" "I'm better than all right," I said. "I'm free to speak truthfully about some things I've observed regarding Aldridge Development's business practices." The silence on the other end was telling. Thomas was a careful man, ethical to his core, and he'd been watching the Aldridge family's political maneuvering with growing concern for months. "What kind of things?" he asked carefully. "The kind that might interest the city council's oversight committee," I said. "The kind that might explain why certain permits get approved so quickly while others sit in bureaucratic limbo for months." We met for coffee Thursday morning at a diner in Davidson, far from Charlotte's downtown political scene. I brought copies of emails Victoria had shown me on her phone, screenshots I'd taken with her permission when she was bragging about her family's connections. Conversations between Gregory Aldridge and council members that went far beyond normal business relationships. "This is concerning, Michael," Thomas said quietly as he reviewed the evidence. "If these communications are authentic, they suggest a pattern of inappropriate influence that needs to be investigated." "There's more," I said. "Gregory Aldridge has been billing the city for environmental impact studies that were never actually conducted. His company creates the reports using generic data from other projects. I've seen the templates." Thomas leaned back in his booth, looking like a man who'd just realized he was dealing with something much bigger than wedding drama. "Why are you bringing this to me? Why now?" "Because they thought I was harmless," I said. "They thought I was so grateful to be included in their world that I'd never question anything I saw. They miscalculated. This could take months to investigate properly," Thomas warned. "Good," I said. "I want it done right." By the following week, Thomas had quietly initiated a preliminary review of Aldridge Development's recent municipal permits. The process would be careful, methodical, and designed to withstand legal scrutiny. Thomas also recommended that I document everything and consider reaching out to investigative journalists who specialized in municipal corruption. But that was just the beginning. The real damage would come from the business relationships I'd observed during my time in the Aldridge family orbit. Gregory had made enemies over the years, competitors he'd undercut, partners he'd cheated, civic leaders he'd insulted. Those people had been waiting for an opportunity to strike back, and I was about to give them the ammunition they needed. The Charlotte Observer story broke 6 weeks later with a headline that made my coffee taste better than it had in months. Questions raised about development permit practices. Jennifer Walsh had done careful work, connecting publicly available information about unusually fast permit approvals with the Aldridge family's generous contributions to specific council members' campaign funds. But the newspaper story was just the opening move. While Jennifer was researching her article, I was working a different angle entirely, one that would hit the Aldridge family where it really hurt. Victoria had bragged to me about their exclusive partnership with Meridian Financial, a private investment group that funded large-scale development projects across the Southeast. The partnership was worth approximately $47 million in credit lines and represented nearly 60% of Aldridge Development's current funding capacity. Gregory had spent 3 years cultivating the relationship with Meridian's senior partners, presenting his family as the pinnacle of Southern business respectability. What Victoria didn't know was that Meridian's managing director, Robert Williams, was someone I'd worked with 5 years ago on a commercial project in Raleigh. We'd developed a solid professional relationship, and more importantly, Robert valued integrity above all else in his business partnerships. His investment group had strict ethics clauses in all their contracts, specifically prohibiting partners from engaging in corrupt practices or questionable municipal relationships. I called Robert Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after the Observer article appeared. "Michael Henderson," he said, his voice pleased but surprised. "I haven't heard from you since the Raleigh Convention Center project. How are you?" "I'm calling about a professional concern," I said. "It involves one of your current investment partners and some practices that might conflict with your company's ethics standards." Robert's tone immediately became serious. Meridian Financial had built their reputation on clean deals and transparent practices. They'd dropped partners before for much less serious infractions than what I was about to describe. "Go on," he said. I told him about the permit irregularities, the suspicious timing of campaign contributions, and the pattern of favorable treatment that the Observer had begun documenting. I sent him copies of the newspaper articles along with public records I'd obtained, showing the correlation between Aldridge Development's political donations and their project approvals. "Robert," I said, "I'm not asking you to take my word for this. Everything I've told you can be independently verified through public records and ongoing municipal reviews. But I thought you should know what kind of practices your partnership might be inadvertently supporting." The silence on the other end lasted nearly 30 seconds. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Michael, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. Meridian takes these allegations very seriously. We'll need to conduct our own investigation immediately." "I understand," I said. "And Robert, you might want to review your contract provisions carefully. This situation may require decisive action." By Thursday afternoon, Aldridge Development received formal notice that Meridian Financial was initiating a comprehensive audit of their business practices and temporarily restricting access to new credit lines pending review. Gregory Aldridge was given 2 weeks to provide documentation for every municipal permit they'd received in the past 5 years, along with detailed records of all political contributions and lobbying activities. The timing was strategic. The Observer's investigative series had made the Aldridge name controversial in local political circles, just as their primary funding source was demanding ethical accountability they couldn't easily provide. Gregory had built his empire on relationships and reputation, both of which were now under intense scrutiny. But I knew this was just the beginning of a much longer process. Real investigations take time, and I was prepared to be patient while the various agencies did their work properly. Friday evening, I was reading the second Observer article. This one focused on Gregory's personal relationships with council members. When my phone rang, Victoria's name appeared on the screen. I'd been expecting this call for days. "Michael," her voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the stress underneath. "We need to talk." "About what?" I asked, though I already knew. "About this media campaign you're running against my family," she said. "About why you're trying to destroy us over something that happened at our wedding." I laughed, genuinely amused. "Victoria, I'm not running any campaign. I'm just sharing information about your family's business practices with people who have a legitimate interest in knowing about them. The media is doing what media does, investigating stories that matter to the public. You're behind this," she insisted. "The audit, the newspaper stories, everything. This is revenge. This is consequences," I said. "Every investigation that's been opened, every question that's been asked, those are the natural result of your family's choices over many years. I'm not creating problems, Victoria. I'm just refusing to help hide them anymore." The line went quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed from anger to something closer to concern. "Michael, you don't understand what you're doing. These investigations could take months, even years, to resolve. Even if my father is cleared of wrongdoing, the damage to our business could be irreversible. That's how justice works," I said. "It's slow, it's thorough, and it's supposed to be uncomfortable for people who have something to hide. If your father has nothing to worry about, then the investigations will prove that. But in the meantime, we're being treated like criminals, she protested. You're being treated like people under investigation, I corrected. There's a difference. Your family spent years avoiding scrutiny by cultivating the right relationships and making the right donations. Now you're finally getting the same level of oversight that every other development company should have been receiving all along. I hung up before she could respond, but not before I heard something that told me this was far from over. The sound of someone who was just beginning to realize how much her family had to lose. Over the next few weeks, I watched from a distance as multiple investigations slowly gathered momentum. Thomas Whitmore's municipal audit was thorough and methodical. The Observer's reporting continued with new revelations almost weekly. And somewhere in the background, I knew that federal agencies were beginning their own preliminary reviews of Aldridge Development's compliance with environmental and contracting regulations. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but they were turning. And for the first time since that moment in the cathedral, I felt genuinely satisfied with the choice I'd made. 6 weeks later, the municipal audit results finally arrived, delivered with the clinical precision of professional accountants who'd found exactly what they'd been hired to find. The City Council's report landed on Gregory Aldridge's desk on a Tuesday morning in early fall. 43 pages of documented irregularities that read like a case study in municipal corruption. I wasn't there to see Gregory's face when he opened that folder, but Thomas Whitmore called me 30 minutes later with the key findings. While not as damaging as I'd hoped, the report documented a clear pattern of preferential treatment and raised serious questions about Aldridge Development's compliance with federal environmental regulations. It's enough to trigger a federal review, Thomas said, his voice mixing professional caution with personal satisfaction. The EPA and other federal agencies will likely open their own investigations based on our findings. But here's what Thomas didn't know, and what I'd been working on during those 6 weeks of waiting. I'd been methodically reaching out to other people who had reasons to see the Aldridge family face consequences. Victoria had introduced me to her cousin Patricia during our engagement, and Patricia's husband, David Manning, was a senior loan officer at First National Bank. During a wine-heavy dinner party months ago, I'd listened to David casually mention how he expedited certain applications for family friends, and how banking relationships were really about trust, not just paperwork. What David didn't know was that I'd been recording that conversation on my phone. After the municipal audit became public, I'd called David's supervisor at First National, a compliance officer named Sarah Henderson, who took banking regulations seriously enough to investigate weekend tips. I sent her the audio recording along with publicly available records showing the suspicious timing of Aldridge Development's loan approvals. Mr. Henderson, Sarah had said after reviewing the evidence, this suggests a pattern of preferential treatment that violates several federal banking regulations. We'll need to conduct a thorough internal investigation. The banking investigation moved faster than the federal environmental review. Within 2 weeks, David Manning was placed on administrative leave pending a full audit of his loan portfolio. The bank's internal compliance department had found enough irregularities to warrant reporting their findings to federal banking regulators. Patricia called Victoria in tears, screaming about how David's suspension was destroying their family's reputation in Charlotte's tight-knit banking community. Victoria called me, but this time her voice carried a different tone. Not just anger, but genuine fear. You got David suspended, she said without preamble. A man with 3 children, Michael. Are you proud of yourself? David got David suspended, I replied calmly. Banking regulators don't suspend senior officers for no reason. If he'd been following proper procedures, he'd still have his job. This has to stop, Victoria said, her voice shaking. You've made your point. My mother was wrong to say what she said about your mother. I was wrong to laugh. But destroying people's careers isn't going to change what happened. I let the silence stretch for a moment, thinking about my mother's face in that cathedral bathroom. The way she'd apologized for existing in a space where she belonged. Victoria, I said, your family spent decades building relationships based on mutual corruption. David bent banking rules for your father. Your father paid bribes to city officials. You all participated in a system that gave you advantages you didn't earn and didn't deserve. I'm not destroying anything, I'm just making sure the right people know about what was already happening. We're not criminals, she protested, though her voice lacked conviction. The federal investigators will determine that, I said. But meanwhile, you might want to prepare for a long process. Federal investigations don't move quickly, Victoria. They're thorough, they're patient, and they don't care about your family's social standing." The line went dead, but my work was just getting started. Over the following weeks, I knew that multiple federal agencies would begin their own investigations into Aldridge Development's practices. The process would be slow, methodical, and ultimately devastating for a family that had built their success on relationships that couldn't withstand scrutiny. But patience, I was learning, was just another tool in the pursuit of justice. 3 months later, news broke that would change everything. The FBI had quietly opened a federal investigation into Aldridge Development's business practices, focusing specifically on their involvement in federally funded infrastructure projects. The investigation had been triggered by the municipal audit findings, but it had taken months of preliminary review before federal agencies decided there was enough evidence to warrant a full investigation. I learned about the federal investigation the same way everyone else did, from Jennifer Walsh's front-page story in the Charlotte Observer. But what the general public didn't know was that the FBI's case had been significantly strengthened by evidence provided by someone with intimate knowledge of Aldridge Development's internal operations, someone who'd been waiting years for the right opportunity to come forward. That someone was Victoria's ex-husband, James Morrison. I'd reached out to James 2 months earlier, using information Victoria had carelessly shared about their bitter divorce proceedings. She'd mentioned how James had tried to demand half of her trust fund during their settlement negotiations, and how her family had used their political connections to ensure he walked away with almost nothing. James answered my call immediately, his voice cautious but interested when I explained who I was and why I was calling. "You're the guy who called off the wedding," he said with obvious satisfaction. "That must have been quite a scene. Victoria hates being embarrassed in public." "I'm calling because I think you and I might have some common interests," I said, "specifically, an interest in seeing the Aldridge family face appropriate consequences for their actions." The conversation that followed revealed why James had never used his evidence before. "During our divorce," he explained, "I tried to expose some of Gregory's questionable practices. I thought it would help my case, show that the family wealth came from corrupt sources. But they crushed me. Their lawyers made me look like a bitter ex-husband trying to destroy his former in-laws out of spite. The judge dismissed everything I presented as vindictive speculation. But now you have credible municipal investigations backing up your claims," I pointed out. "Exactly," James said. "Back then I was just a disgruntled ex-husband with allegations. Now I'm a witness with corroborating evidence from independent sources. The FBI actually returns calls from people in my position." James had kept copies of everything from his marriage to Victoria, emails, financial records, recorded conversations where Gregory had described his federal contract schemes with casual arrogance. He'd been sitting on this evidence for 3 years, waiting for circumstances that would make his testimony credible rather than vindictive. My call gave him exactly the opportunity he'd been waiting for. "They destroyed my reputation," James told me during our second conversation. "Spread rumors about my business practices, got me blacklisted from several law firms in Charlotte. All because I dared to ask for what was legally mine during our divorce and threatened to expose how they really made their money." Over the following weeks, James had quietly contacted the FBI's Charlotte field office through his own attorney, providing them with 7 years' worth of documentation about Aldridge Development's federal contract practices. The evidence included detailed records of how they'd systematically defrauded federal environmental oversight programs, billing for studies that were never conducted and claiming compliance with regulations they'd completely ignored. But the federal investigation was moving at typical federal speed, slowly, methodically, and with great attention to legal procedure. It would be months before any arrests were made and potentially years before trials began. Meanwhile, the local consequences were mounting steadily. 2 major insurance companies had canceled Aldridge Development's policies pending resolution of the federal investigation. 3 planned projects had been put on indefinite hold while environmental compliance was reviewed. Gregory's legal expenses were mounting rapidly as he hired specialists in federal criminal defense. Victoria called me the day the Observer broke the story about James's cooperation with federal investigators. "James," she said, her voice hollow with disbelief, "my ex-husband is helping to destroy my family. Do you understand what you've done, Michael? You've turned people who should be loyal to us into enemies." "I didn't turn James into anything," I said. Your family did that when they crushed him during your divorce. I just gave him an opportunity to tell the truth when someone would actually listen. He's lying, she said desperately. He's making up stories to get revenge on us for the divorce settlement. Victoria, I said patiently, James's testimony is being corroborated by municipal audits, banking investigations, and federal environmental reviews. If he were lying, the inconsistencies would be obvious. The fact that multiple independent investigations are reaching the same conclusions should tell you something. There was a long pause on the line. How long will this take? She asked finally. Her voice small. Federal investigations are thorough, I said. Expect this to continue for at least a year, possibly 2 or 3. And that's just the investigation phase. If charges are filed, the legal proceedings could take even longer. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. The Aldridge family had built their empire on the assumption that problems could be solved quickly, with the right phone calls and financial incentives. They were about to discover what it felt like to face a system that couldn't be rushed, bought, or intimidated. Justice moves slowly, but it moves. And for the first time in months, I felt genuinely patient about the outcome. The bankruptcy filing came 8 months later, on a cold February morning that felt appropriate for the death of a dynasty. Aldridge Development, once worth an estimated $200 million, officially declared insolvency after mounting legal costs, frozen credit lines, and the inability to secure new projects while under federal investigation. I read about it over coffee in my home office, where I'd been working since my own business had started suffering consequences from my association with the Aldridge scandal. 3 potential clients had quietly backed out of consulting contracts once they learned about my role in the investigation. Word travels fast in Charlotte's business community, and many companies didn't want to hire someone with a reputation for weaponizing insider information against former partners. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I'd been systematically destroying the Aldridge empire, I'd also been damaging my own professional reputation among the type of wealthy clients who'd built my consulting practice. But unlike the Aldridges, I'd been prepared for consequences. The bankruptcy was just paperwork, though. The real satisfaction came from watching how their social world had abandoned them once their legal troubles became public knowledge and dragged on for months. The Country Club of Charlotte had quietly terminated the Aldridge family's membership 6 months earlier, citing ongoing legal circumstances inconsistent with club values. The symphony orchestra had removed Gregory's name from their board of directors. Multiple charitable foundations had returned donations that had come from Aldridge Development, not wanting their organizations associated with federal fraud investigations. Most telling of all, the Prescott family, who Victoria had always described as their closest friends, had completely cut off contact. Elizabeth Prescott, who'd been maid of honor at our canceled wedding, had been avoiding Victoria's calls for months. The Whitmore family had uninvited them from their annual Christmas gala. Even their longtime attorney had started requiring payment in advance as Gregory's legal bills mounted. Victoria called me that February evening, but this time her voice had changed completely. Gone was the desperate pleading from our early conversations, replaced by something that sounded like exhausted acceptance. It's over, she said simply. The bankruptcy made it official, but it's been over for months. We've lost everything. How are you doing? I asked, genuinely curious about how she was handling the complete dismantling of her former life. I'm working, she said, with a tone that suggested this was still a novel concept for her. Retail management at a department store in Concord. It's honest work, and it pays enough to cover rent on a small apartment. I never thought I'd say this, but there's something satisfying about earning my own money. And your mother? She's struggling. Mom never learned how to exist without the social structure that defined her whole life. Dad being under federal investigation is hard enough, but losing all her friends has been devastating. She's in therapy, trying to understand how we got here. There was a long pause on the line. I owe you an apology, Michael, Victoria continued. Not just for what happened at the wedding, but for everything that led up to it. I spent 38 years believing that my family's wealth and connections made us better than other people. It never occurred to me that we might have been worse. Victoria, I said. I appreciate that, but the real test isn't recognizing what was wrong. It's building something better going forward. I'm trying, she said. It's harder than I thought it would be, starting over at my age with no real skills. But I'm learning things I never knew before, like how to budget for groceries, how to earn respect instead of demanding it, how to apologize when I make mistakes. After I hung up, I sat in my home office looking at my own changed circumstances. My consulting practice had shrunk significantly as word spread about my vindictive campaign against the Aldridges. Several former clients had made it clear they wouldn't work with someone who might turn professional relationships into weapons if personal disputes arose. But I wasn't struggling. I'd saved enough money over the years to weather a temporary downturn, and I'd discovered that there was actually strong demand for my services among smaller companies and nonprofits, organizations that valued ethical standards over social connections. More importantly, I'd started receiving calls from other whistleblowers and fraud victims who needed someone with experience navigating complex legal and financial systems, people whose employers had cheated them, whose business partners had stolen from them, whose powerful opponents thought they could escape consequences through wealth and influence. The work paid less than what I'd earned serving Charlotte's corporate elite, but it felt more meaningful. Every case I took meant someone like my mother wouldn't have to face their fight alone. 6 months after the bankruptcy filing, I received a Christmas card from Victoria. She was still working retail, but she'd been promoted to assistant manager. The card included a photo of her volunteering at a homeless shelter, looking genuinely happy for the first time since I'd known her. Inside, she'd written, "Thank you for showing me the difference between having power and using it responsibly. I'm still learning, but I'm learning." The federal investigation was ongoing, moving at its characteristic pace through grand jury proceedings and plea negotiations. Gregory's trial was still months away, but the outcome seemed inevitable. The evidence was overwhelming, and his former business partners had been cooperating with prosecutors to reduce their own exposure. Justice moves slowly, but it moves. And sometimes, the waiting is part of the punishment. The trial began 18 months later, on a Monday morning in September, when Charlotte was just beginning to feel the first hints of fall. The federal investigation had taken over a year to complete, followed by 6 months of pretrial motions and plea negotiations that ultimately failed. I wasn't required to testify. The evidence spoke for itself, but I attended several key days, sitting in the back of the federal courthouse and watching Gregory Aldridge face the consequences of 40 years of corruption. The prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness. Email after email showing Gregory coordinating bribes with city officials, financial records proving that environmental impact studies had been fabricated, testimony from former employees who described a systematic culture of fraud that extended from municipal permits to federal contract compliance. Gregory's defense team tried to paint him as a successful businessman who'd occasionally cut corners but never intended to break federal law. They argued that the charges were politically motivated, that their client was being scapegoated for practices that were common throughout the development industry. The jury wasn't buying it. James Morrison's testimony was particularly damaging. He took the stand during the trial's second week, looking confident and professional in a Navy suit that emphasized how far he'd come since his divorce from Victoria. For 4 hours, he methodically destroyed any illusion that Gregory's crimes had been accidental or isolated incidents. "Mr. Aldridge once told me," James testified, "that environmental regulations were just suggestions for people who couldn't afford better lawyers. He said the key to successful development was knowing which officials needed campaign contributions and which ones needed jobs for their relatives." The defense attorney objected repeatedly, but the damage was done. Gregory's own words, recorded during family dinners and casual conversations, painted a picture of a man who viewed legal compliance as an optional business expense. Victoria attended the trial sporadically. Her work schedule at the department store didn't allow for daily courthouse visits. When she did appear, sitting in the back rows rather than the family section, I could see how much she'd changed over the past year and a half. She'd lost weight, but more than that, she carried herself differently. Gone was the entitled posture of someone who'd never questioned her place in the world. She looked like someone who'd learned to work for what she had, someone who understood the value of things she'd once taken for granted. During a recess in the third week of testimony, she approached me in the courthouse lobby. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice carrying none of the desperation or anger from our previous conversations. We walked to a coffee shop across the street, one of those chain places that served courthouse employees who needed caffeine to get through their days. Victoria ordered black coffee and sat across from me, her hands steady as she raised the cup. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she began, "about the difference between love and possession. You were right. I did want to reshape you rather than accept you. I think that's how my family approached everyone. We saw people as projects to be improved or obstacles to be managed. That's a hard thing to recognize about yourself, I said. It's been a hard year and a half, she replied. Working retail teaches you things about yourself that you never learn when people are paid to be nice to you. I've been yelled at by customers who think I'm stupid because I work in a store. I've had managers who treat me like I'm disposable. For the first time in my life, I understand what it feels like to be powerless. She paused, looking out the window toward the courthouse where her father's fate was being decided. I finally understand why what my mother said to yours was so cruel, she continued. It wasn't just the words. It was the power dynamic. Mom knew your mother couldn't fight back, couldn't defend herself without seeming inappropriate at her son's wedding. That made the comment not just rude, but genuinely cruel. Victoria, I said, I appreciate you telling me this, but understanding what happened doesn't change what happened. I know, she said quietly. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just trying to make sure I never become the kind of person who finds entertainment in someone else's humiliation again. We sat in silence for a few minutes, watching courthouse employees and lawyers hurry past the window with their briefcases and urgent conversations. How has this affected your business? She asked finally. I'd been wondering if she would ask about that. Some clients stopped working with me, I admitted. People in your family's social circle didn't appreciate learning that business relationships could become legal liabilities if they weren't ethical. But I've found new clients, smaller companies, nonprofits, people who need help standing up to the kind of power your family used to wield. Do you regret it? She asked. The professional cost, I mean. I thought about that question, considering everything I'd gained and lost over the past 2 years. No, I said finally. I learned that I was building my career on relationships with people who shared your family's values, people who thought wealth and connections made them better than others. Losing those clients was probably good for my soul, even if it was bad for my bank account. Victoria nodded, looking like someone who understood the complexity of necessary losses. Dad's going to be convicted, she said, not asking for my opinion but stating what we both knew to be true. Probably, I agreed. The evidence is overwhelming. 20 years, she said quietly. He'll likely die in prison. That's what happens when you spend 40 years committing federal crimes, I said, not unkindly but without sympathy. When court reconvened, Victoria returned to the back rows while I found my usual seat. The trial would continue for another week, but the outcome seemed inevitable. Gregory Aldridge had built his empire on corruption, and now he would face the full weight of federal justice. But watching Victoria walk back into that courtroom, her shoulders straight despite everything that had collapsed around her, I realized that sometimes the most important transformations happen not to the people who are punished, but to the people who learn to see clearly for the first time. Gregory Aldridge was sentenced on a Tuesday morning in late November, almost exactly 3 years after that disastrous wedding at St. Michael's Cathedral. Judge Patricia Hendricks delivered the verdict with the clinical precision of someone who'd seen too many powerful men claim ignorance of their own crimes. 18 years in federal prison. Full restitution of $12 million in fraudulent federal contracts. Lifetime ban from any business involving federal contracts or municipal development. At 71 years old, Gregory Aldridge would likely die in prison. I watched his face as Judge Hendricks read the sentence, looking for some sign of remorse or recognition of the damage he'd caused. Instead, I saw only the bewildered anger of a man who'd spent his entire life believing that wealth could purchase immunity from consequences. Victoria was not in the courtroom that day. She'd moved to Atlanta 8 months earlier, taking a job with a legal aid clinic that helped low-income families navigate housing disputes and consumer fraud cases. The work paid a fraction of what she'd once spent on shoes, but she'd told me during our last conversation that it was the first job she'd ever had that made her feel useful, rather than just privileged. After the sentencing, I walked outside into the November sunshine and called my mother. It's over, I told her. Gregory got 18 years. How do you feel? She asked, the question I'd been asking myself for months. Tired, I said finally. Not vindicated, not satisfied, just tired. That's wisdom, she said with the insight that comes from surviving 8 decades of other people's choices. Justice doesn't feel the same as revenge, Michael. It's quieter and more complicated. That evening I sat in my home office reviewing what the past 3 years had cost and gained. My consulting practice had stabilized at about 60% of its previous size, serving smaller companies and nonprofit organizations that valued ethical expertise over social connections. The work was more meaningful, even if it was less lucrative. I'd helped 17 whistleblowers and fraud victims navigate legal systems designed to protect the powerful. Each case reminded me that my mother's humiliation in that cathedral had been just one example of how wealth and influence shield people from accountability, until someone decides to stop looking the other way. 6 weeks after Gregory's sentencing, I received a letter postmarked from Atlanta. Victoria's handwriting had changed over the years, less ornate, more practical, like someone who'd learned to take notes during training sessions rather than sign donation checks. Michael, the letter began, I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about what justice means. For 3 years, I thought justice was what was happening to my father, the investigation, the trial, the prison sentence. But I was wrong. Justice isn't just punishment for past wrongs. It's also prevention of future ones. I work with families every day who are facing eviction because landlords like my father found ways to skirt tenant protection laws. I help elderly people who've been cheated by contractors who learned corruption from developers like my father. Every case teaches me that my family's crimes had ripple effects I never considered. You didn't just expose my father's corruption. You showed me what it looked like from the other side. I understand now that the woman my mother humiliated at our wedding represented everyone my family had stepped on while climbing to the top, everyone whose dignity we'd sacrificed for our convenience. I can't undo 40 years of learned cruelty, but I can spend however many years I have left trying to balance the scales. Thank you for forcing me to see clearly, even when it hurt. Your mother raised a good man. I hope I can learn to be half as decent as she taught you to be. I read the letter twice, then filed it away with all the other documentation from the Aldridge case. Not because I'd forgiven anyone, but because some stories need complete endings, and Victoria's letter provided the closure that formal justice couldn't deliver. A year later, I was having dinner with my mother at her favorite restaurant when she asked me a question that changed everything. What are you going to do with what you learned? What do you mean? You spent 3 years proving that powerful people can face consequences, she said. Now I want to see you spend some time making sure other people like me don't have to wait for someone like you to defend them. She was right, as she usually was. Revenge had been satisfying, but it was ultimately just destruction. Real justice would be building systems that prevented future Gregory Aldridges from accumulating the power to hurt people like my mother. Over the following months, I started working with local legal aid organizations, training volunteers to recognize financial fraud and municipal corruption. I developed workshops for small business owners about protecting themselves from predatory lending practices. I even testified before the city council about strengthening ethics oversight for development projects. The work was less dramatic than bringing down a corrupt empire, but it was more sustainable. Every workshop I taught, every volunteer I trained, every policy I helped improve meant fewer people would face their fights alone. 3 years after Gregory's sentencing, I received a Christmas card from Victoria. She'd been promoted to senior advocate at her legal aid clinic and was working on legislation to strengthen tenant protections statewide. The card included a photo of her at a community center, leading a workshop for families facing foreclosure. Inside, she'd written, 6 years ago, I thought power meant never having to face consequences. Now I know it means taking responsibility for consequences you didn't intend. Thank you for the hardest lesson I ever needed to learn. People still ask me sometimes if I regret how far I went, if I think the punishment was proportionate to the crime. And my answer has evolved over the years. My mother deserved to be treated with dignity at her son's wedding. When the Aldridge family chose to humiliate her instead, they revealed who they really were. Everything that happened afterward was just the logical conclusion of that revelation. I didn't destroy Gregory Aldridge's empire to get revenge for an insult. I exposed his empire because the same attitudes that made his family think they could humiliate my mother were the same attitudes that made them think they could defraud federal agencies, bribe municipal officials, and destroy protected ecosystems without consequences. The humiliation in the cathedral was just a symptom. The corruption was the disease. Treating the disease required more than just punishing one family. It required changing systems that protect people like them while exploiting people like my mother. In the end, the difference between revenge and justice isn't about punishment versus mercy. It's about whether you're trying to balance scales or build better scales. Real justice doesn't just hold people accountable for past wrongs. It makes future wrongs harder to commit and hide. And sometimes, that's enough.